All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next webinar titled Breaking Down Barriers, a Culturally Responsive Career Development Intervention with Racially webinar. I am Dr. Diana Camillo. I am one of the co-directors of the Center for Equity in Post-Secondary Advising with Dr. Laura Owen at San Diego State. Today, our presenter is Dr. Marsha Rutledge. And I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Eric Hines. Dr. Rutledge is an assistant professor in the counselor education program at Longwood University. She is a former professional school counselor with 18 years of school counseling experience. Dr. Rutledge's research, her interests include career development of racial, ethnic, minority, female youth, improving outcomes for minoritized student populations, and culturally responsive school counseling. Dr. Rutledge is an active member of the Virginia School Counselor Association, where she has served in many capacities, most recently as the chair of the Communications and Public Relations Committee, and now is part of the Research and Graduate Student Committee. Very busy. She has recently been tasked to serve the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee with the American School Council Association, as well as the chair of the Anti-Racism Committee. Dr. Rutledge has presented at several national, state, and local conferences, and we are honored to have you present with us today. So I will hand it over to Dr. Eric Hines, who will introduce a little bit about our series that we are hosting with the center.
Thank you, Dr. Camillo. Again, we appreciate you and Dr. Owen for hosting this equity-based career development and post-secondary readiness series, which is part of our special issue that we just got published recently. Dr. Renee Mays from University of Arizona, as well as Dr. Paul Harris from the Pennsylvania State University. Myself all served as co-editors for the current issue in the Journal of College Access, and the special issue is entitled Equity-Based Career Development and Post-Secondary Readiness. We want to thank Dr. Marsha Rutledge, as well as her co-author, Dr. Philip Nilka. If I butchered it, I apologize.
No, that's fine.
Okay, today she will be having a conversation with us on her article, which is in the special issue, Breaking Down Barriers, a Culturally Responsive Career Development Intervention with Racially Minoritized Girls of Color. We also want you to check out the special issue. We have 8 wonderful scholarly articles that talk about career development and post-secondary pathways from an equity-based lens. And I will drop the link into the chat for those who are interested in reading more. It's free, so you can just pull up the articles. And last but not least, our companion textbook that Dr. Laura Owen and I recently published, Equity-Based Career Development and Post-Secondary Readiness, an American Imperative, is also a great read as well. We go into depth. In fact, Dr. Mays, Dr. Harris, and I believe Dr. Rutledge are all authors in this textbook. And we really talk about and focus on race, gender, sexuality, as well as what school counselors can do. And we have a little bit of information on career technical education from the equity-based perspective. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Mays, who will get us started on this lovely conversation today.
Thanks, Dr. Hines. I'm Marsha, Dr. Rutledge. I'm going to call you all sorts of amazing.
Either way is fine.
I'm delighted by your piece. I think especially as someone else who cares about and researches things related to Black girls and women, but also someone who just fangirls out when other people are doing like really amazing work. So I might start us off with this particular question. So often in conversations about CCR, like what's really needed in order to serve folks of color, particularly youth of color, there often is this thought of like, well, Black and brown girls are fine. We really need to focus on boys and men. And so help that seems to be a misconception. So help us understand maybe the impetus for your particular article and why this is so important.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of literature out there that speaks to our African American males. And what I found was there wasn't a lot of literature for our females of color. There are great scholars out there that focus on our young women of color, but in terms of like the school counseling context and in terms of culturally responsive programs with this population, it wasn't a lot. But we know that there's research that says our Black females, right, especially in the career development world, face certain barriers, right? And so our young women, our young students grow up to be these same females, right? The reason why this project was done actually was because we were going through an interview process. And my colleague and I noticed that there was like this distinct difference between the way people interviewed in the process. And we began to think about, what does that mean? What does that say? Where do we learn our career development skills? Where do we get that from? How do we have access to building that for ourselves? Because what happened, it ended up being a barrier to getting the job, right? And so as we were thinking about this, I'm like, Marsha, you know, it's us who teach it, right? As school counselors, we focus on college and career readiness. And why not start at that middle school level where they are in some formative years about career interests and beginning to make those decisions about what they want to do in life, what courses they want to take, and so forth. And so I thought about how we could tailor some level of intervention towards these young females of color so that we can talk about the barriers that they may face when they get into the working world, so that we can build a certain level of this particular project is around career decision-making self-efficacy, but just building the knowledge and career-related skills that they'll need once they get out into the working world. So I thought it was very important to formulate or create this program that would kind of help with that. We don't have a lot of interventions that speak to that. I think we have a lot of like general college and career readiness stuff. But one thing that we're taught is that we have to meet the needs of the students in which we're serving, right? So we have to understand the population in which we're working with. And we know that our students of color have unique needs. And so therefore our interventions have to match that. And so that's how this project, that's how this program was born, based upon what I was seeing in the community and kind of backing it up a little bit and seeing how we can build a better foundation before they even get there.
I absolutely love that, right? So as a person who teaches career, we are having some of those same conversations, and I think often there's this disconnect between a lot of the literature that's out there, even career theory, right? Like career theory doesn't think about Black girls or girls of color. We have some theory that says we should care about gender roles, which great, yeah, we should. Or some theory that maybe says we should think about how cultural factors kind of come into play, but not things that help intersect. And often, like at that point of intersection, that's where girls of color live, where talking about gender doesn't quite get it, or talking about race doesn't quite get it. It's really kind of like that. It's that intersectionality, right, piece that comes along that we need to shine the light on. I'm curious. So you mentioned that there are some unique barriers that girls of color face. And I'm wondering if you might just kind of highlight perhaps some of those unique barriers, but perhaps also some of the strengths that girls of color have in this process. Because we're obviously not empty, right? But we also don't know what we don't know, right? So I'm curious if you might give us that kind of holistic, what's going on in terms of barriers and strengths in the process.
Well, I think you talked a little bit about that intersection of the racial and ethnic identity along with the gender, right? We know historically that there are barriers there in terms of job obtainment or career obtainment, certain career fields that we don't even consider or there may be barriers in entering that particular career field. We know that there are barriers in like differing pay scales and so forth. And so one of the barriers related to this is just the development of skill, the development of knowledge, access to those resources, access to role models that have done it before and can kind of share back with things that they faced and how they overcame them and things like that. I think all of those are some barriers that are unique to this particular population, depending upon where the students are located, you know, when the lack of resources and access to experiences, to meeting people in different career fields, being able to go and see college campuses and things like that, right? So there are a lot of different areas, but at the same time, I think for people of color, they come with a certain level of strength. We come with a certain level of resiliency, and to overcome some of those obstacles, I think is kind of innate culturally within us. And I think that we have, speaking as a Black female, I think we have a certain level of passion, right? A certain level of overcomeness, right? That we can
have to.
Right. To continue, you know, on the journey. And so I think for this particular population, it was important to empower them, right? And to speak that they have this within them that they can use to better themselves, better their situations and so forth. Where this project was done, it was in a rural area, right? So there definitely was a lack of access to different things. And so I was so proud of the program because it allowed them to do things that they probably wouldn't have gotten to do, honestly. And so that was a plus. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was doing an interview with Black girls in particular, and just curious about how they experience school and how they experience school counseling, and kind of all of the domains. And I recall most of them saying that career stuff wasn't something that they did with school counselors. And one in particular said, you know what, Google was my career coach. And I thought, oh no, like that's one, I'm so glad you're so resourceful, but you also are in high school. You don't know, like you have someone who's trained, who should be guiding you. Like that's a failure on our part as school counselors, on our part as people in schools. But I think it also highlights, like what you've said, there's a way like that women of color have just had to figure it out, because if we don't do it, then it doesn't get done. But that shouldn't be what we expect of students, right? It shouldn't be what we expect. I think in a way that it allows schools to be off the hook. It allows career counselors and coaches to be off the hook and allow them to kind of adultify, right? Like women of color, girls of color, and kind of say, well, you figure it out, and / you did figure it out, so I was obviously right. It's like, no, there's a whole lot that goes into that process beyond just finding whatever the next opportunity is. And you highlighted that it's more than getting admission, right? Like there's skills along the way that we want to understand. There are things that are happening in the job market that we need to render explicit and help our students, especially our girls of color, know how to navigate and how to be savvy about it without losing their soul, right? Like there's a way that we can do this that respects our culture, respects our ancestors, and like looks at our cultural strengths, rather than saying our culture and our way of knowing and understanding doesn't matter and we need to do it over here like this.
Yeah, that is exactly where the cultural responsiveness piece comes in, right? Often I think about, you know, in the educational world, we look at the data, right? We look at disaggregated data to see where the need is, right? So in Virginia, we have what we call gap groups, right? So we have our students with disabilities, we have our English language learners, we have our African-American students, and we have like our Hispanic students, right? And so any good principal, he or she takes a look at the data, right? And sees where people are either underperforming or overperforming or whatever, right? And so they would create interventions based upon what the data is telling them, right? So I see that the same way here, right? Instead of giving general career development programs, knowing that there are unique needs to this population, we should be creating unique interventions to meet those needs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, so Flame, I think, is really, really cool and unique and definitely culturally responsive in sustaining in terms of content delivery, all of the things I think that really matter here. I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about some of the like foundational pillars of Flame. So what if I were to make Flame soup for lack of better, what are the key ingredients here that make Flame a possibility?
Yeah, so Flame, so Female Leadership Academy for Minority Excellence is what it was. And so we were really intentional about the information that we included in the program, right? And so one of the things that we really wanted to do was, one, introduce them to some possible barriers that they were going to face, right? So we were very real and explicit about what the gender gap looks like, you know, what discrimination looks like in the workplace and so forth, right? So introducing them to that, because they really may not have even thought about it before, right? Looking at how to build them as leaders, building that confidence level, that despite those barriers, here are ways and strategies and skills that you can use to kind of overcome that. We looked at career interest inventories and began thinking about what may be a good fit, thinking outside of the box. We know the research tells us that they typically think within this box or bubble and kind of pushing out those limits a little bit. We had Longwood Career Services come and do resume writing, career interviewing, and things like that. We had a lot of role models come. We had a Hispanic Heritage Senator that we took them to visit down in Richmond. We had the first Black female district attorney. We had, at that time, she was the Black superintendent of education. We had a number of people that come and kind of share their experiences, share their stories with these students. We did mock interviews where they got real feedback about how they presented themselves, goal setting, just a number of different. We had Chev, which is our state council for higher education. They came and talked about college admissions and things like that. So I think it was a well-rounded program that introduced them to a lot of information. So they were gaining this information, but then they were also applying it in like activities and so forth within the sessions. And so I think that they found that helpful because it wasn't just sit and listen, right? It was very, very engaging in how we did that. And it was based off of like social learning theory and social cognitive career theory. And looking at those experiences, those resources, and how that relates to how they make career choices and build self-efficacy and all of those things. And so that's the kind of short version of some of the things that we did within the session. There was a lot of motivation, a lot of empowerment. They did vision boards and things like that. So it was kind of, very broad categories that we packed a lot in the 15 weeks that we had. Yeah.
That's excellent. I especially like that it's not just a counselor or facilitator and students, right? And girls and girls of color, but it becomes a community thing, right? Like, I think that's very culturally responsive, right? Like I think especially girls of color can come from communities that are collectivistic, that are, the college going experience isn't just about me, it's about my community. And I want to be connected with other folks who look like me, who are out there trailblazing because I want to, one, see myself in a different way or represented, but also it, like, I think reconnects us to our community, our ancestors, all of that stuff. I think sometimes schooling can try to push that out and make it a very individual exercise rather than kind of embracing the community that we are a part of. So I super love it. I'm going to sit in on your group. Can you do that for adults? do it for us old folks who are looking to hone in on our skills and get some Dr. Rutledge training, because this sounds so wonderful.
Yeah, I think it would definitely be beneficial for adults as well, right?
I can think of, I mean, you've already said this earlier, that you might be interviewing for jobs and you can see that there are maybe just gaps or just ways that you're like, oh, it's probably not your fault that you don't know this. But somewhere along the line, there wasn't that training or that support to develop that I could see this kind of growing beyond K through 12 and like existing as something that happens with college students or community members that by no fault of their own, like just haven't gotten this stuff right. Like they've done the best they can with what they know. Well, also like you have created this thing that I think incorporates some cultural capital that I think allows for some expansion of skills. Yeah. I wonder, so you actually implemented this, right? Mm-hmm. I'm curious, is there a moment that you had while you were facilitating this or running this that you were like, oh yeah, this is it, like the sweet spot of like, oh yeah, like it's doing the thing we wanted it to do? Like, is there a moment that stands out to you for this?
So, I was thinking about that, and I can't pinpoint a moment, but I thought about this. Regardless of what the data told me, I know that the program was impactful just because of the connections that the students were able to make with each other, right? The leadership skills that they were able to exhibit, the relationships that they made while they were participating in the program, the access that they had to other individuals and so forth. It was a powerful experience. The relationships that they maintained with myself and the other two facilitators, I think was extremely, extremely powerful. And so the feedback, the narrative feedback that we got was just as powerful or is as impactful as what the statistical data told us. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was amazed that anybody I called and said, can you do? They were like, sure. Once I explained the program, they were like, I'm on board. And so it was a wonderful experience to be able to put all that together. My CTE director was on board, and because it related to, college and career readiness. So I had a good support system in implementing the program.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, it seems like, respectfully, we're in troubling times, that there are often some challenges, right? Especially when you want to do things that focus specifically on race or gender in a school. And perhaps that wasn't the case as so severe as it is now for you. But I wonder if you have some thoughts about folks who wanted to implement this. How might they navigate the rough terrain that exists right now in terms of kind of selling this as it's important to do, while I also know anti-CRT, anti-school counseling, anti-SEL, like all of that stuff exists in many states or is brewing in many states.
So you know what, that's a great point, because I don't know what it would look like if I was trying to do this today, right? But one of the things that I say, and I did have support, let me say that, but of course there was some pushback, right? I had a board member call my principal and say, I heard that there's a group for only Black girls, you know, and of course that was not the case. It was for anybody that identified, any female that identified as, you know, a person of color or a minoritized population. But the one thing I will say is know the why, have a purpose, know the data, know the research behind what you're doing and why, right? So I could be able to say, here the research is saying at the middle school level, we need to focus on, you know, career development for one, right? And then I was able to say, based upon the research, we know that there are barriers for our students of color, right? And so I was able to give that that background, that context to the program. And then talking about, you know, tailoring interventions to meet the needs of the students, right? That's what we're tasked to do. And so being able to speak that language. And then one of the pieces of the project was like student motivation and engagement, right? So tying it to academics, right? Tying it to school success, I think are all ways that that support what you're trying to do, right? But then you got to hold yourself accountable with, you know, tracking the data, analyzing the data. Our girls went to the school board meeting after the program was over, and they presented on their experience in the program and so forth. And so just kind of making all of those connections, I think, is extremely helpful to getting the support that you need.
So you're saying we need to be savvy and keep speaking the language of schools, right? So knowing that,
yes,
that are important or priorities, and saying, well, don't we care about this? Well, here's the thing we can do.
Exactly.
Now we have Flame as a thing that we can pitch that can meet the needs, the unique needs of middle school girls of color, which I have to tell you, middle school is my favorite. They're like I feel like middle school, they're the aliens that no one wants to touch, but I'm like, they just don't know who they are yet. And it's like, what a great time to hang out with them and say, yeah, I'm in my 30s and still figuring it out. Like, this is a good journey to be.
Listen, you have to have a love. You have to have a love. I did high school for like 10 years before moving to middle school. But once I got there, I'm like you, I loved it, right? Because they were still somewhat impressionable. But, you know, they were coming into themselves. You could still be kind of creative in how you work with them and so forth. So, yeah, I agree. It's a great population to work with.
They're just goofy, like in the best way. Like I maybe am silly. I talk to my students about like middle school, and I'm like, yeah, you know, it's that Britney Spears moment, not a girl, but not yet a woman, and they're kind of like in between and figuring it out, and like you just gotta embrace it. Like they still laugh with you. Like high school, they kind of laugh at you. Middle school, they're like, oh yeah, you're like kind of cool, a little
great point.
Pretty cool.
Great point. Yeah.
I love it. I also want to honor that there are other people in the room. I realize I have so many questions and ideas and things. I
wanted to say one thing when you said that, you know, you said something like, you know, we have Flame. And I just want to say to like our scholars and our researchers and our counselor educators, we need so much more evidence, right? We need more research to say these are things that work, right? I think one of the things that we hear a lot from our practicing school counselors is, you know, we need like concrete, practical things that we can kind of take and run with. And I don't think that we really have that in school counseling. So we really need to create and test these types of programs so that we can hand them over. I think we need to collaborate more with our practicing school counselors who are in it, right? It was at the time that this project was done, I was in the school, so it was much easier for me to have access and things like that. And so I think that is beneficial to us as counselor educators who are doing the research to be able to partner with these school counselors who have access to students and so forth. Now, I totally understand that some school systems like, oh, you're not coming in here doing research on my kids and stuff like that. So you have to build a relationship, and then you have to give back to them, right? What does the data tell you that will help improve that school situation, that school counseling program, and so forth. So, you have to be strategic in how you do it, but I think that's very important for us to build that connection and partnership.
I wonder too, and I'll ask if other folks have questions and zip it myself. So I think it's a really important point in thinking about like our role as counselor educators, and one, like contributing to the knowledge base and looking for evidence, right? Like evidence base is or evidence informed stuff is really, really good. How do you see us as counselor educators incorporating this stuff in our own teaching, right? Our own, like, so we have a career class. How do you see something like Flame being a part of what we kind of teach and train pre-service school counselors, or even, right, career counselors in general?
Yeah. I think you have to be intentional about incorporating it, right? You have to be intentional about talking about diverse populations of students and what do our direct interventions look like for our Latinx students, or our students with disabilities, or our English language learners, and really breaking it down for them, having them do projects that take on the needs of a particular cultural group or race and ethnicity, or taking on learning about and creating interventions based upon certain topics, getting them comfortable discussing it, analyzing the data, disaggregating the data to see, okay, where, yeah, it may say that, 80% of the students are doing well, but when you break it down, who is that 80%, right? And are we missing any gaps and things like that? So as a counselor educator, it just takes a level of intentionality to bring that up, right? And to make it an integral part of not just the class, but the entire program, right? Mm-hmm. I know my kids probably be like, oh my gosh, here she goes again, talking about culture or, whatever. But it's that important, right? Because when they go out into the field and they're going to be working with a diverse population, they have to understand that all interventions are not going to work for all students. And they have to be able to adapt, right? And if they don't do it in the classroom with us, they're not going to do it when they get out there, right? So building it in, being intentional about it through discussions, projects, and so forth, and just really focusing on having them practice those skills while they're with us.
I think it's just so important. I think about often counselor ed programs in general will say, yeah, we do diversity stuff, and it's all packed into the one diversity course, which great, but it's more an overview of like, maybe we should think about these things, right? Like, I don't know that you walk away with, as a school counselor, this is how this is incorporated into my work, or as a CMHC, right? Like, it really is, and it has to be, right? Like, in terms of giving a common language or a common understanding, that it really is those other courses where we say, now this is the skill part. Like, you got the theory, now let's get the skills part. And without that, there's this disconnect between care about diversity, but I don't have skills to actually be active and to demonstrate my care other than I have some words to say. So I really appreciate that it's more than just it's words. We need to practice. Like, it's a skill that gets honed and developed. And if we're not doing it in programs, especially in career, we can't expect our pre-service school counseling students, or any counseling student, to graduate and be ready to meet the call, right? To meet the need.
Right. They should take that skill, that knowledge, and those skills that they learn in that multicultural course, and then the application piece should be in every other course in the program. Yeah.
Absolutely. I get the like, oh, here she goes again, stuff too. So I'm like, oh, good. So you already know what we're gonna do. So why haven't you done it yet?
Right.
Language of love. So I wonder, if there are questions or thoughts from other folks who are present in our Zoom room that you would like to bring up with the group or ask Dr. Rutledge in particular.
Listen, I am just enjoying the conversation. This is such rich dialogue, such a good paper, such a good contribution. And Dr. Rutledge, it's just good to see you and hear you talk about your work. And you know, when reading, like, you know, when you got to the recommendations part of your paper, you know, it was like the page limit, right? Like you had to stop somewhere, but I just felt like there was so many implications for so many different people to discuss, which I think is a testament to the work, right, that you did. And so I'm curious, because of your involvement in all of these different spaces, kind of what you might say to the SCA boards, you know, VSCA and other SCAs, about how they could take what you've done here and use it for their advocacy efforts, you know, across their states, for young Black and brown girls.
That's an interesting question, because in a lot of the spaces that I've been involved in, one of the things that has constantly come up, and I won't go into depth because it'll be a whole nother webinar after I say this, but one of the things that comes up is the Ask a National model, right? And how beneficial it is to all of our students, to our minoritized populations, and what are we teaching and why, right? And do we have the evidence that we need to say that it supports, you know, all of our students? Actually, I'm doing a project, I'm finishing up a project now where we're looking at the ramp schools versus non-ramp schools, and the impact on academic success for certain populations. So race and ethnicity, low SES status, and things like that. And I think that our associations and our governing bodies and so forth really have to go back and evaluate the frameworks that we're pushing out to our practicing school counselors, and really examining whether or not they work or whether they're too general to meet the needs of all of our students. Does it really incorporate, you know, don't get me wrong, I think ASCA in a recent year or so is trying and doing a better job of talking about our students of color and minoritized populations and what that looks like, but I think we still have a ways to go. I think it goes back to, we need more evidence-based research. It's easy for us to sit here and say, oh, this is what we need to be doing. And then somebody say how, and be like, oh, well, you got to wait on that, right? So we need that research to say this is how, not just why, but this is how. So I would say to the organizations to, let's do that research. Let's come up with the programs. Let's come up with the ways that school counselors can tailor and adapt and create these culturally responsive interventions. And then I would also say, being on the anti-racism committee and looking through that data and so forth, continuing to show or express the need for school counselors to understand the importance of the work. We know that there are still some individuals who don't get it, who don't believe that they have to take culture into consideration and so forth. And so we need the backing of our associations to say, no, yes, you do, right? We know that our students come to school with a certain, with their cultural backgrounds. I think Renee said it earlier, with ways of being, ways of knowing, and so forth. And we all know that the educational system sometimes tears that down or puts that on the shelf and requires them to operate from another perspective, another view, which is detrimental to our minoritized students. And so how can our organizations kind of help maybe change the trajectory of the face of education? That's a lofty goal right there, but still, I think that I think that's what's needed, right? Because the diversity isn't going away, right? And so we have to continue to think about innovative ways that we can support our students if nobody else does.
I love it. I love it. And you kind of kid about it being a whole nother webinar, but seriously, there you have so much for more papers even, right? Like there are so many different implications and stakeholders who can grab hold of this and do some really good work. And so what I'm trying to say is I look forward to to continuing to read more of your work in that regard, because it's impactful. And to that end, right, and not to get too perhaps far ahead of ourselves with this question, but my mind went to some of the SEA boards because of some of the work I know you had already been doing in that regard. I'm curious, in your mind, is there anything else we haven't touched on yet as in terms of future-oriented work that extends what you've done in terms of your own writing or other groups that would pick up what you've written to use it? Are there things that you're dreaming of right now? You mentioned Lofty, and I was like, yes, come on, Dr. Rutledge, give us that, because our kids deserve Lofty, right? Like they deserve all of that. And so what are some of those dreams that you're thinking about related to this work and where it can head and who can get a hold of it and do something with it? That's a stacked question like no counselor should ever ask. But
I know, I'm like, oh gosh.
I graduated, so whatever. Mm-hmm.
But no, in the bio, what was stated is absolutely true. So I'm passionate about bettering the outcomes of our minoritized students. I think that they need the support, and they need the boots on the ground or the action to kind of help change the face of education. Seriously. I actually right now, I support a school system when I can or when they are in need. And I've been at Longwood, I think about 4 years. So going back into the building, I'm just amazed at how things have changed since I was a school counselor. But what it has is just made me more aware of the need, honestly, to support our students. And so really thinking about how do we, as a counselor educator, so there's a couple of different things. So one is we still need to work on diversifying the school counseling profession, right? And so there was a beginning of another project that really hasn't worked itself out yet, but looking at who we are admitting into the programs and how are there barriers there to enrolling and graduating people of color from school counseling programs, right? So that's step one, is let's get them in the programs and graduate them so they can get into the fields, because we know that this particular career field is dominated by white females. So we need more males, right? And we need people of color in the field. So looking at how we can do that, right? And then looking at how we can change, adapt, or create a new framework where anti-racist practices, diversity, equity, and inclusion, culturally responsiveness is already embedded, so that when we teach it, it's there. When they implement it, it's there, right? And we're not having to play catch up to say, oh, but you gotta add this on, right? Or you gotta tweak this to make it fit for the population. So I think that's my quick answer, right? Of some ways that I hope to be able to continue to contribute, to the profession in the future.
You got me freedom dreaming, Dr. Rutledge, right? What world would this be if school counseling at its very core, at its center, was anti-racist, it was DEI, and then everything else built out, right? Rather than, as you've said, it's this additive, like sprinkle on some diversity, sprinkle on some anti-racism. Right. That's not how it works. Like, we're trying to repair school counseling history that never thought about the fact that there are non-white, non-cis het people that exist in this world, non-disabled, like disabled, right? Like, we're trying to tweak a thing or reform a thing that was never meant to serve the students that we're serving now. I mean, we have to be critical consumers of it, right? Like, that's the whole history of education, right? Like, education as we know it in the US is a colonial endeavor and is serving students that it was never intended to serve. Like, what would it mean if we created this thing that was actually meant to do what we want it to do? This is my favorite.
Absolutely. And so, I think about, the last 2 years and the pandemic, and people started talking about, reimagining education and reinventing education and things like that, changing the face of education. And for a minute, I got excited, right? I got excited. I got hopeful. I was like, yes, if ever a time, we're going to do it now. And I haven't seen it yet, right? Actually, I'm kind of seeing us go backwards a little bit, which is disheartening. But that doesn't mean that we don't continue to push and try to change the system, right? That wasn't created for our babies.
Right. There's this like, oh yeah, like energy, as you said, around like reimagining or kind of resetting education, and then everyone's like, can we just go back to normal? Like, but normal wasn't working. Like, it wasn't working for most of the students that we have. But I get that it's comfortable, but comfortable for whom?
Right.
It's so disheartening.
Right.
But I'm following the Dr. Marsha Rutledge leadership team. I'm a fan, and girl, lead me, sis. Where are we going next? And what are we gonna take on? Because I'm so energized by your work and just excited. I think especially as we think about how we can exist in schools and love and support students from a strengths perspective, right? From a perspective that says you are worthy, you have all the potential in the world, and I just want to help you unlock it. Rather than, I think, the perspective that often happens in school of, I got to fix those kids. I'm not fixing it. I'm loving them.
That deficit approach.
Right, they're already whole. They were not broken. They're whole and wonderful. And sometimes you just got to get out the way and stop messing with them, so that so their greatness can shine. And I feel like Flame is the thing that does that. Flame is like, you are great. We are in a world that doesn't recognize your greatness.
Yeah,
we're gonna making it move. We're gonna make moves in that direction.
Yeah. One of the things I think about as you were talking, and it goes back to that pushback scenario, right? And so the comfort level in doing this work is not comfortable work to begin with, right? And we have to be able to be okay with not being comfortable. But one of the misconceptions about creating programs like this or doing work like this is that it's a either or type situation, right? That we're only focusing on this population and we disregard the other. And I want to make it clear that that's not the case, right? Because I think when you're creating these programs to meet the needs of the students, I think you're building a better culture of the school. To be more inclusive, to say we're trying to work to better all of our students, right? And so I think that there's a misconception about this type of work negates all other work or diminishes other populations and so forth. And I just want to make it clear that that's not the case, right? Because a lot of the skills and a lot of the work is transferable, regardless of population. But what we're saying is, what are the specific needs of that particular population, right? And even when you think about culturally responsive work, it doesn't even have to be, You're taking into consideration the needs of, your white students as well. And what does that intervention look like? And you're taking a look at the needs of your students with disabilities, and what does that need look like, right? And so a lot of times we get caught up in this either or. So I caution, the people who are listening to this, maybe a little bit later, those practicing school counselors who say, oh, I can't do that. Well, yes, you can, right? Yes, you can, because it's not to the detriment of other people. It's being more inclusive of the populations that you serve.
Dr. Rutledge, I'm enjoying this conversation today. You and Dr. Mays are tag teaming like no other. I love that flow. The question that I do have, you alluded to it earlier, and I wanted to ask before we had to end our session is, can you talk a little bit about what may be the implications or some of the takeaways we should know about working with Black and Latino, Latinx girls in rural areas? I think that's one conversation that we don't have. We always talk about students of color in urban school settings, but we don't really talk about what is it like to work with students, what are their needs, what are the resources that are needed to work with Black folk, Latinx folks, students of color, especially in the South, where a lot of them do live in rural areas. I'm in Tallahassee now, and you go a county over, it's majority Black in Gaston County. So can you speak a little bit about that as we round it up? Because I think some of our rural school counselors may need to, and some of our urban school counselors may need to understand that there may be some different needs for our students of color out in rural areas.
Yeah, so, with that, I really think it goes back to access. Access to people, access to resources. And there was the larger project, there was a rural component to this, to the initial work in this, and understanding that what I found for the students, that self-efficacy piece, that confidence building piece is key for rural students who may not have seen people in their family go to college, who may not have seen people in their family take a professional position, go to grad school, things of that sort, right? So they don't have the context to say, maybe I can do that, right? And so they take on some of the norms of the community instead of kind of thinking broader, because they don't have that access to see it, right? And so school counselors in rural areas, I think, here, I love the word intention, because I think any presentation I use this word, because you have to be intentional about, okay, what's lacking and how can I fill it, right? Who can I bring in, or where can I take them so that they can have access? It's like taking some of the limits off, removing some of the barriers so that they can kind of think outside the box. They can kind of expand their career choices in a way that they may not have thought about before, right? And I think you have to build that into your comprehensive school counseling program. The struggle with the rural area, though, is what that comprehensive school counseling program looks like. What are they actually doing in the schools? And that's part of the problem, right? The larger problem is the profession in general and our inconsistencies about who we are and what we do. But in the rural areas, you tend to find school counselors who aren't really school counseling. Let me just put it like that, right? They have all of these other duties to where the school counseling piece gets lost, right? And so we have to find a way to bring that back. And that's when Paul talked about to the associations and things like that. I think that's another thing, to make sure that all of our school counselors are school counselors and that they're doing the work, right? One conversation I remember having a while back is, if you think about the field that we're in, right? You can become a school counselor and you could have graduated 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, right? And never get retrained, right? You just continue on doing what you do, right? But you wouldn't go to a doctor that hasn't like upped their skill level or, advance, with the latest, techniques and things like that. But in education, we do that, right? We just continue on doing what we do. And there are some school counselors who may not have been to one conference since, they graduated. And so I think it's important that we are continually updating with the field, right? And making sure that the school counselors that are in the building are updating with the field so that our students can benefit. I think I went off on a tangent there, but the main thing was for the rural, for the rural schools, one, we have to make sure that school counseling is happening in an appropriate way, right? And then looking at resource and access and building self-efficacy and confidence, I think are some of the main takeaways for that population.
Thank you.
I think we may have time either for a last question or perhaps just maybe a final thought from you, Dr. Rutledge, about this work and where you see it going or the impact that you see it having on the field.
Yeah, I want to say that this has been a lot of fun, right? And it has been interesting for me to talk about it because it has raised some ideas even for myself, like, okay, what are you going to do next, right? What are you going to do with this? But I think that one of the things that I really want to focus on is making sure that, or finding a way that information like this gets into the right hands, right? That's another conversation that I think in higher ed or counselor ed we talk about is who are we writing to, right? And who's reading these things? Because if the school counselors aren't reading it, it's hardly benefiting the students. Yeah, we can use it in our programs and in training, but we have to be able to get the word out to our school counselors. And that's one thing I appreciate about this committee that I'm on with our Virginia Association is that we've started doing like briefs where we break down the article and then we push that out to our school counselors so that they're having access, to what the literature is saying in a condensed way, which may be more meaningful for them. So I think, as much as I talk about what school counselors should be doing, I also talk about what we as counselor educators could and should be doing. So again, that takeaway is continue the research to provide that evidence-based work for our school counselors, right? Collaborating with school counselors on the research and then getting the research and the literature in their hands so that they can really digest it and use it.
I really appreciate that, right? Like, so we as school counselor educators can exist in the ivory tower and perpetuate that wall between us and the town, right? Or us and the community, which we talk about serving. And so I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that comes into how do I make sure that this is, one, happening in schools, but also coming back to folks who are serving students in schools and communities. That's absolutely on target with how we keep changing the profession and pushing the profession forward as we want to cater to and meet the needs of all of our students. So I want to just thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation too. I don't know if my fangirling and geeking out over here has been too much, but I don't care because I feel like this is joyful, and so let's be joyful about it. So just thank you again for spending some time with us and imparting all, or even just a little a pinch of your knowledge and expertise with us, and certainly folks who will watch this at a later point. Again, thank you so much.
Well, I think